Rahmani wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam wa barik ala Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Wassalamu alayka ayyuhan nabiyyu wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Allahumma anfa'na ma fa'na min amlamtana ya hamamin. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to teach us what benefit us from what He taught us, Ya Hamamin. Wa salatu wa rahma, wa dawah wa baraka, Ya Hamamin. Today, my brothers and sisters and Nigerians in Islam, Aki and Akwana, our topic today is about question and answer in Islam. Can a person bury a disease abroad when he or she has a lot of relatives in his nation, in his country? Like for example, if you're in Africa and you have somebody that have died, but your entire relative is in Africa, but somebody that have died, can you bury that person abroad, in America? The answer is yes or no. It's an Islamic question and answer today we are going to discuss about. Well, according to the scholars that know about it, they say that if a deceased person died abroad and the relative that deceased person have are many in the Africa, or are many in the country that deceased person have, they cannot bury that person abroad. In other words, in Islam we do not allow the dead body to sleep. Is that not so? So if you have a deceased person that have died and you want to go and bury that person abroad, if that person have a lot of relatives in this dunya, in this country, in the country, you can bury that person in the country that the person died. But if the person does not have any many relative in this country, in the country that he or she died, you can bury that person abroad so that you can see the other relative abroad. If that person have a relative abroad and a relative in the nation and the country that he or she died, if that person they want to go and bury that person, if the person have little relative in abroad, they cannot bury that person abroad. They can bury that person in the country that the person died. Because if that person have lots of relative in the country that he or she died, they can bury that deceased person in the country that he or she died. But if that person have a little relative abroad, they cannot bury that person in abroad. They can only just, if the person have a lot of relative abroad, well, definitely they can bury that person abroad so that they can see the deceased person face, or they can make the mourning and they can have condolence for him or her. In other words, Islamically, we are trying to talk about if you have a relative abroad, you have a lot of relative abroad. Like for example, you have a lot of relative in America and you have a lot of relative in Africa. That is a different issue. If you have a lot of relative in America and you have a little relative in Africa, in your country where you are, they can bury that deceased person in abroad. But if you have a little relative in abroad and you have a lot of relative in Africa, they can bury that person, that deceased person in Africa, because that is where a lot of relatives are. That is what the Islamic scholars are trying to deliberate on. Subhanaka Allahumma bihamdika, subhanaka Allahumma bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Jazakallahu fikum.